Express itself is great because it gives you support for routing, so you can handle multiple URLs. And the other neat thing is that it also supports multiple templating engines, so you can template your HTML. Nice thing about Express that I really like is that it's very simple, it's open source, very straightforward, and it's inspired by Sinatra from Ruby on Rails. So if you're coming from the Ruby language, so if you're coming from Ruby, you might recognize a lot of the stuff that we're going to be showing you today. And it's definitely.
It's also, if you know any Python, it's very similar to Flask.
To Flask as well.
Yeah, so it's one of those things when I first saw it, I was like, and I think I said this the other day, I was like, oh, it's just like Sinatra, which was like the only framework I think I've learned like in Ruby outside of Ruby and Rails and then using Sinatra. So it was one of those things. So I think even if you're doing a simple Node application where you're going to handle more than one kind of URL, like or one kind of request at that address, probably using a framework is a good idea, because once you start to see just how easy it abstracts that stuff out for you, you'll be like, oh, that totally makes sense. It's so much cleaner. It's easier to read. I know where everything is, right? That's how I'd feel.
That's something that I definitely agree with. And you'll see it in some of our sample demo code. It doesn't add much lines of code to your actual code base. So you can achieve a lot with Express without having to do too much coding.
Awesome. So installing and using Express. Express, you can, basically you can get it through NPM, and you need to install it. You can install it globally, you can install it locally. And it's really just 2 commands. And what we're going to be using here, is you'll see on the screen, is we're going to be npm install express. So I'll just basically open up the command line and I'll run npm install express, and I'm also installing Jade. And Jade is something that we're not going to cover in this module. We'll cover in further modules. But Jade is templating language, for lack of better kind of terminology. Right? And you'll see Express, because Express not only handles a lot of that the routing, it also, it has the templating features, right? So you can use a variety of different templating engines, can you not? Yeah, you can use Mustache if that's the one that you're familiar with. Or if you're coming from the front-end environments, you've probably used Mustache, or even the underscore templating engine. You can also use that one as well. You can even create your own templating engine. Handlebars.
Just inject it. It's really flexible, very open. You can use whatever one that you want.
Right. So we're going to kind of get into just, looking at what a basic simple REST API looks like and how it works. We're going to break down some of those things for you. And then we're also going to just kind of talk a little bit more about Express and some of the other features, like we had mentioned already, like the term middleware, which, you'll read a lot about it. And then you go to search for what is middleware. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but we'll kind of walk through a little bit of those kind of things for you. So when it comes to, we're looking at making a basic kind of REST API. Again, you have your kind of routing that you need for your API, and that's where you're going to get certain kinds of information. So, you're looking to get students. You might have, an endpoint for students, for get, for post, for a student in particular, an ID, all those kind of things. So we should talk about routing a little bit and how important that is.
Yeah.
So a router maps basically your request to a callback, right? So, if we're looking at Express and we're kind of like looking at those kind of things, you'll see that we kind of register what we think that route should be. Sometimes you write it straight up as like /students. Sometimes you're writing, you can write regular expressions, those kind of things if you want to do that. Most of these requests are often, like I think you previously said, we've got get, post, right? Put, delete.
Put, patch. If you guys can name the other ones on the chat window, we'll give you bonus points.
Yeah. For how many you tend to use, right? I'm usually a get post person. I never delete anything. I just archive it. I put like a variable in the database. It's just like show or, active or whatever. But, you can delete all those kind of things. And the URLs kind of describe where the location is targeted, right?
Yeah. So basically, with the URL, you can also set a path. So that's the target path that you want. So the minute that someone puts that in the browser, all right, and you put that in your router in Express, the callback will be executed for that path, so that it's going to go for that target.
Right, so if you're doing something like, I want to get the information for a particular student, you would probably in your path have to include the ID or some kind of recognizer for that student. So it might be student/1, for example. And then I would use the 1 in that callback to figure out what I need to do. Exactly. Right? Maybe I'm returning a simple string, maybe I'm going to a database, maybe I'm taking that ID and I'm going to an API, whatever it may be. So the URL really does describe a lot of kind of like what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And then again, we talked a little bit about a request handler and the callback, and you can see on my screen I have an example at the bottom that's, you'll see, and this is what Express looks like. You basically kind of create an app or an Express app, and you have .get, meaning that someone's going to be getting the index, and what should happen when they get the index, that callback that should be called, and you get your request and you get the result of what you want to do with that, or that response, sorry. Yeah. So, routes, you start to see this across the board, whether you're using front-end frameworks, for example, you'll see the idea of a router. It's handling what's coming off the URL, and, maybe you set up the state of your application for that. And then you also are seeing it now, again, on the server side, which is a lot of frameworks, no matter what language you're in, kind of do that, because that's a lot of work to do. Right? Like setting up that stuff and figuring out what's going on. If you're going to write all that stuff yourself, that can be a fair chunk of work. So why not use a framework, right? So here's on my screen just the code for creating a simple Express application, and I'll shortly open up Visual Studio. We'll take a look at it, and I'll just run it on the command line, and I'll show you just a couple other things about Express. But if we start to look at this slide, you can start to see that we're requiring a module called Express. Once again, require, you can think of require as like you need to import something, or it's requiring it to work. And those are often, depending on what you're using or whatnot, you might instantiate and use those at the top of your file. You might do it throughout. It depends on how you tend to write your code. And then we create a variable that's instantiated to Express. So we're creating an Express app fundamentally here. And Express has a bunch of things, bunch of functions and features that you can add. And all we're doing here is we're saying when you get basically this URL, which is, I'm going to the root of the application. Here's what I want to have happen. And so you get that, you write that response, and right here you see that we're writing JSON. We're writing a basic message, with some text. And, what happens is that when you hit that URL, that's a response that we're returning to you, right? And then on the last line, we're going app.listen, and we have an environment variable there, for example. So if you guys are used to deploying stuff, maybe you work this way, locally, where you might have a local version, a production version, a staging version. Maybe you're used to, pushing stuff, no problem up to the web, and you instantiate your environment variables. We have that environment variable that we're looking for. So we're saying, if this exists, use it, and if not, use 8080, right, for this example. Yep. And that's a basic, very simple Express application. There's no bells and whistles here. Like, it's dead simple. And this is a great example of what you'd use for something that's just like a REST API. So I'm just going to open up the code in Visual Studio, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of run it on the command line and show you that in action. So in Visual Studio, if I go to 08 Express REST, you will see, now if you're looking at my Visual Studio, you'll see right here that I have, it says, NPM, there's node modules, right? So what happens is that, I've got this local kind of node modules folder that has all of these things installed. And what you need to do with these kind of packages, if you're following along with us, what you need to do is the first thing you do when you get any kind of a node project is that you kind of navigate to the directory that it is in, and then you type in npm install. And it's going to look at anything from that package JSON, and it's going to install all of those things. So if I kind of just navigate, for example, into this folder, and let's just bring up my directories, and I'm just going to go 08 tab. There we go. All right, so if I just list out what's here, I see I have a package JSON. So if you had just pulled this down and you're following along and you navigated into this folder, you have to get really used to working on the command line with Node. And once you do, you get used to all the things you need to do. But the first thing you need to do is just go npm install. Now, for me, I've already done this, so it's kind of going to go through and it's going to like say, okay, there's not too much to worry about. But for anyone else, you potentially might need to do this. Now, the other thing that you need to do when you're working with Express is that you need to install Express. So npm install Express is how you install Express. And it will go through and you'll see that it's kind of working a little bit, and it will, you see all these new things that show up. And you're starting to see, okay, well, I've got all these things that Express also requires in order to work. So I've installed Express. You will also need to go npm install Jade. Again, I've done this. It's going to go through the process again, and it's going to go and it's going to install those things. All right. That's how you need to get started with it at the very, very beginning in order just to even work with Express. So you need to have Express installed. You need to have, for example, we're using Jade. Maybe you might be using a different templating engine at some point in time that you're more familiar with or that you like. But, for example, we're using Jade. And so once you've done that and you've hit npm install, so any of these modules that you've gone in and you're trying to run them or you're trying to use any of them, make sure that before you do, you navigate to the directory and you hit npm install. And it will go through that package JSON and it will install any of the things that are listed as dependencies. Because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to go and run that, you're going to run Node, you're going to run the app.js, most of them are called, and then you're going to realize, oh, okay, something's happening here, I got an error, I need to fix it. Usually it's just installing your modules. You kind of get used to it.
Can you show us what the package.json looks like?
Sure.
This module?
Yeah. So this is what it looks like from this module. So you can start to see what the dependencies are here, right? So we know that this is going to be, some description about the project itself, right? I've got the name, the version. So this is really handy if you're doing any kind of versioning, right? And I'm looking at your GitHub and I'm like, oh, did he update? Oh, awesome. It's still 000, no update. You can start to communicate that to the community this way, right? Author, name, email, in case you want to get email and support your project, as everyone does, right? And you're like, I just did it. Try to make it work. And then you got your dependencies that are listed. Do you want to talk a little bit about the dependencies or, any of these kind of things?
Yeah, so if you've noticed when she was running npm install Express, if you add a -- save, what that will actually do is it'll add it to the package.json. So the next time that you get this module, and let's say that it depends on 20 different modules, you don't need to remember each one. You don't need to npm install each one. You can just run npm install, and what that will do is it will read whatever the dependencies are in package.json and install them for you. Right. So here's an example that Stacy can do. Maybe you can install underscore and save it. You can see what happens to...
so npm install underscore -- save, right?
Yep.
If I'm installing that, it should be pulling it down, and just that -- save is basically saying, hey, go put it back to my package JSON, update this file, right?
That's right.
So I'm doing that. I get a whole bunch of messages. It's like, I love you, messages. And then, of course, you get the, hey, this has been modified. What do you do? Of course, I say yes, right? And then we see underscore, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about the syntax here that you start to see in terms of like what a star might mean, or
Yeah, so this syntax that you're seeing is called semantic versioning, and essentially it will specify which version that you want Express to be in. And in the first case, we're specifying the exact version that we want, 3.4.4. Now, for Jade, you'll see the star, and what the star means is just install any version of Jade.
Yeah.
And
I don't care.
yeah, it's like, I don't
Give
care.
it to me
just
all.
like, whatever, whichever one's the latest one, get that one.
Whatevs.
Whatevs.
Whatevs. Yeah.
And the underscore one is a little special, though. It's got this little hat. I don't know
little
what
carrot.
it's called. The carrot. Yeah, I don't know what it's called.
Carrot. Looks like a carrot. Totally does not look like a carrot.
But all that's going to do is going to say that, hey, I want 1.7 and then any minor version up of that one specifically. So if it's the latest one is 1.7.2, it's going to get that one. If it's 1.7.3, it's going to get one. Or if it's still 0, then we'll use that one.
Right.
Now, one thing I do want to show you with Node Tools for Visual Studio, if you installed it, maybe we can hop to my screen. And one thing you'll notice that if I did not run npm install, you'll notice on the side, if I open up the npm little symbol, direction arrow,
you'll get nothing.
You'll get nothing. And it'll tell you, so Visual Studio will actually read the package.json and say, hey, you're missing a bunch of modules.
It's so friendly. It's just like, hey, hey, buddy.
Yeah, you won't be able to run this.
Yeah.
A neat feature, if you don't want to use the command prompt, you can just right-click on npm and it'll give you all these options. Install new npm packages, install missing ones, update npm packages, and that will do exactly what you did on the command prompt, just Visual Studio will run it for you. You don't need to go.
So if you're one of those people who's a little afraid of like living the 80s dream of, living in the command prompt, Visual Studio kind of like exposes some of those things, so you don't spend as much time.
And if you don't believe me that it's the same function call, it'll actually just show you in the output right here on my screen. Here it is. This is the command that it executed, npm install.
Yeah. So friendly. It's like a nice little reminder. So, if we look at this app.js, which we kind of walked through in the previous example on the slide, we're going to go ahead and we're just, going to basically run this app and see what happens. So according to this, I should be running on 8080 as this port.
Yeah.
Right. So what you need to do is I'm going to go into the command prompt again, and I'm already in that folder. So I'm going to go node app.js. I don't need to specify a port. Now, if you don't have a port listed and you want to override that, it's basically -p and then you put in whatever number you want. So 9,000, for example. But we don't need to do that. We've got it listed. So that's just, a good to know for you. So node.app.js. Hold on, throwing an error. This is always fun because then you get to see what's going on here. Oh, you know what? Let's change that port because maybe something's using it. Remember this happened when we were doing this the other day.
It's true.
So I'm just going to change this to be 7001, let's say. Something crazy. And just tab up. And there we go. We know that something's kind of going on. And I can open up my browser and I can go to localhost, and it was 1001, I believe. And you can see this being written back, right? And so we've kind of modified IE so that it actually writes back the string rather than download the file here. If you're working in another browser, you might have a JSON viewer that'll show it all nicely formatted, but you can start to see that we simply created an API, we're writing back some data, right? So this, for me, I love working with Node in this way to create simple APIs, especially if I'm working with someone who's doing the server side and I don't know what the data is going to be quite yet, and you kind of agree, you have that contract for the data model, and you're like, okay, I know it should be like this. Okay, I take that, I emulate it however I need to emulate it, and I'm doing that actual process of going out and getting, hitting the URL, getting the data, bringing it back, and then when I go to switch it, to the actual produced kind of services, in theory, I'm going to hope that, it goes way smoother than, me just kind of writing this object internally and kind of bringing it back. You'll see in the URL here, anything that we're talking about in terms of port, super important because you could be running Node, you could be running a Python app, you could be running a whole bunch of things. They're going to take up ports, and so just understanding that that port is your identifier, and you need to always remember what that item is. Let's go back a little bit to just Visual Studio Express. Now, if you had that error like I had, for example, where it's throwing you an error and you're thinking, everything's installed, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, just try a different port. Your port might be blocked, something might be running on it, you might not know. First things first, don't worry about all the apps that will show you what's running on ports or anything. Just try a different port right away. See if that works. The other thing is sometimes, if you're working in the command prompts, you might have a couple instances of something running because you forget, I'll just create a new command prompt and start something. Close out your command prompts and then start it again.
Yeah.
So, that's a basic kind of API for Express in a nutshell. And so you can take that quite a bit further, obviously. Now, I was going to go to another slide, but what I'm going to just talk about here briefly is, we're just doing something that's getting on that URL. We could change this URL, so we can add in another route if we wanted to here. So I could say, for example, home, right? And if if you went to this URL home, I could change this message, I could change this response, and that's how you start to work with the routing. This, for example, we just wrote back a basic JSON message. This is like your hello world of simple REST APIs, right? But you could, at some point here, do something on the server side where maybe you're requiring a node module that's going to go and get the latest data from an authorized user on Facebook or something. And you might go and get that process here, or go to the database, for example, here, and then return it, right? So those are some of the things that you can kind of do. We should talk a little bit about middleware and the idea of middleware. We don't have an example necessarily
we do,
in here.
Actually, Project 7.
Oh, there you go. Oh, sorry, I went right to the rest and I didn't do. Oh, my bad.
Problem. If you open app.js on
there we
Project
go.
7.
We can walk through this. This is actually the best one to walk through.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'll notice.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, middleware is this idea of being able to stick other request handlers right before your own request handler. So you can chain handlers so that you can execute other things like, for example, handle the templating language that you're using, or handle the JSON formatting. So you can attach all of these middleware that will execute so if you think about it, you get the new request, it'll execute all these middleware in order before it gets to your callback.
Right, so I go to the URL and I say I'm going /students, right? And so for example, you take that request and you might have some middleware, whatever that middleware that might be, and maybe it's going to go and format that in a certain way. Right? Maybe it's going to go and store it somewhere else, or aggregate those things. So it's the middleman, right?
Exactly.
It intercepts it, basically, does whatever it needs to do, does its magic, forwards on that stuff to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so if we actually pop up that project and go to app.js, there's a really interesting middleware that I'd like to show, and that's on line 25. And I'll show you line 24 as well. What you'll notice what line 24 does is it requires a module called stylus that Stacy will show you in a future part of this course. And what it does is say, hey, for this stylus module, get me the middleware, and I'm going to pass it a path to a folder to the public folder. And what this middleware is going to do is anytime that there's a .style file, it will actually compile it into a CSS file. So we'll explain what all that means in a second. And the next thing that I do want to show is this express static function. So if you wanted to just serve straight out files and not have to handle any specific custom request, you can literally just serve your files with that. And what it'll do is it'll take a look at the public folder as we path to it, pass to it, and anything that's in the path of that public folder will just get return right away.
I think, and going through this example, it begs us to kind of walk through a little bit of the folder structure that Express creates for you, right?
That's right.
And so Express does have a sense of folder structure. You can use something that's like, it's called Express generator, where you can install npm Express generator and then create an Express. It's simply like a command. It's like Express. You specify what kind of style sheets or preprocessor you want to use or whatnot, and it'll create that structure for you.
Right.
So if you're looking at an Express project, you tend to have things that are going to be in different folders for structure-wise. And so you'll have things like views, routes, right? You have a public folder. Public folder is client side. So it's like your JavaScripts. It's going to be your CSS that you need. It's going to be any images that you're trying to pull in, right? Anything that you're used to as a front-end developer, you might have in an assets folder or something along those lines. You might call it that. That's actually public. I'm going to show this to the public. And so that's where you can start to see the separation of client-side versus server-side JavaScript. Views tend to hold your templating, right? So if we go to my screen, you'll see in this kind of example right here, you'll see the views have an index and a layout, right? And then you'll also see, so that's usually where you put your templates for views. Again, the beauty of using a template is that you can use it again and again. So if you're building something that's very much like a web application, chances are, you're going to have a list item that you just iterate over again and again. You're going to, you're going to have any of that kind of HTML stuff that, you need to kind of write to the page that you repeat. So that's one of the nice things about templates. You just put them there and you're good. Now, you might have routes, and so you might separate your routes. And a great example is that, your basic route might be your index.js, right? So that's like you're just into your root, but you might have / student or user. So you might create a JavaScript that just handles that. And then again, you have your public folder, which has, style sheets, JavaScripts, images, depending on how you've structured your project. If you use preprocessors, you might have something along these lines that, another folder that, like you said, takes that, compiles it, serves it up, whatever you need to do. So this, just taking a look at this, is very much the standard kind of, any kind of layout or structure that you get for an Express app. And it's probably best to follow that because, it's pretty much the industry standard. You have things like Yeoman or any of those generators that can kind of, lay out their project for you. So, that's probably one of the best things to go through. If we kind of just walk through this app, fairly quickly, we can kind of just walk through a couple other things that Express has or exposes to you so that you're a little bit more familiar. I went right to the simple demo, but we have, basically creating an Express app. You can, again, set all your environment stuff. You can say, here's the path to where my views are, for example. So anytime I want to use a view, you already know where the path is.
So what's a view exactly?
For a view would be any kind of like templating snippet of, depending on what templating engine you use, it's going to be what you use to kind of return back and write to the page in that response, right? When you're responding with HTML, for example. So
you could return an HTML view.
Sure.
Or a Jade in this case.
Sure. Yep, whatever templating that you're using. For example, the next thing that we specified was which view engine are we using? We're using Jade here, right? Mm-hmm. Then you got all sorts of other things that you can start to kind of get into. And the one thing about Express that's really lovely is that their documentation is actually really good. You have to go through it. You have to read it. You have to be not me, basically. But once you do, the documentation is good. So, you can start to realize how to do a lot of other things. So, we're going through and we see all of these kind of different features, whether it be like how you're going to log stuff out, whether, you're going to use JSON, all this kind of stuff. And again, going down, we talked a little bit just about the middleware idea that, okay, I'm going to use some middleware here. Stylus is a pretty popular one for middleware, but there's a bunch of them.
And these are all middleware. Anytime that you use the function app.use, you're inserting
fundamentally,
middleware.
Yeah. And then, just walking through, you can start to see, if you're a dev who works locally and then maybe has a couple environments where you're pushing to production, and then you're pushing to staging. You might set up your environment here where you're trying to figure out like what environment you're running. And you can start to figure out those kind of things, whether you want to use logging or you got to set other stuff up, however you might be doing that. And then you can set your routes. And again, we're just showing get here. So